Even if you're a football fan, you must admit one thing. It is profoundly very silly. Why? Well, people's whole weekend can be ruined because they saw one set of millionaires put less spheres in a string net than another set of millionaires. That is silly. The footballers too are very silly. Just look at Garnacho's eyebrows. And they've all got arm sleeve tattoos too, which makes them even easier to identify when they're caught balls deep in not their legal wag in a sneaky photo taken by their conquest during a closed season trip to Magaluf these days. Footballers used to be even sillier though. Think of Gascoigne, Higuita, Valderrama, and of course Nottingham Forest striker Jason Lee, who has, of course, got a pineapple on his head. We can see that he did indeed have a pineapple on his head, but we may well not have if it wasn't for comedians David Baddiel and Frank Skinner and their mid to late 90s television show Fantasy Football League. Accompanied by straight man football brainiac Angus Loughran, aka Stato, the BBC Two show initially was based around the eponymous fantasy football aspect, which we will go into when we get to the game, I think. As the show progressed, it became less fixated on fantasy football and then more heavily into the comedic aspect of it all, such as the rather goofy reenactments of famous situations from matches past in Phoenix from the Flames, and of course that aforementioned song aimed at Jason Lee. The Jason Lee song was controversial as Lee became a figure of fun at every ground he visited, which was made even worse by Baddiel dressing in blackface to impersonate him. He has since apologised. As well as providing laughs throughout the regular season, they also ran alternate night specials for Euro 96, and then a series of specials on ITV for World Cup 1998 and Euro 2004. As well as bringing us entertainment via their football-related telly programme, the pair teamed up with Ian Brodie of the Lightning Seeds to give us that most timeless of England's songs, Three Lions, a hopeful, self-deprecating song that's often wrongly derided for being arrogant by opposing fans, especially given England's trophy-phobic status. The show returned in 2022 to Sky Max with a new lineup. Matt Lucas of Little Britain and Welsh stand-up comedian, and Mr. Dobby from Peep Show, Ellis James, took presenting duties backed up by a new statistician in BT Sport presenter Andrew Mensah. The show returned more to its fantasy football roots, but it still kept up the daft comedy. But just what is fantasy football? And what by definition is this game, Fantasy Manager, the computer game, a licensed game of the Fantasy Football League television show? Rest assured the game is more following the fantasy football part of the show than any of the comedy. In fact, there's no comedy in it at all, unless you think David Baddiel and Frank Skinner smiling while looking off screen is hilarious. There's only that one image of them in the entire game. Fantasy football was based on fantasy baseball, which was invented in 1990. It translated very swiftly to other sports, including soccer. The concept was that fans would assemble a dream team using a set fictional transfer kitty. Better players commanded bigger fees. Shearer, Cantona and Giggs could eat most of your budget. You'd have to balance the team with an Ian Woan, an Andy Hinchcliffe or a Steve Grizovic if you wanted to build your entire 11. The better each player did in their actual real-life games, the more points your team would accrue. It's very exciting when Stuart Castledine, your Wimbledon midfielder, bought for just 0.5 million, gets a hat-trick. But it's not so good when your star striker, Robbie Fowler, goes for a dry patch and then gets himself injured. What a waste of 4 million that was. As a concept, it's utterly brilliant, and newspapers turned fantasy football into a huge national competition with big prizes for budding Sir Alex Fergusons. And it's still extremely popular to this day. So how does this translate to a computer game like the one Anco put on the Amiga in 1994? They were, of course, dab hands at football on the Amiga, being the producers of the not as good as Sensi but still very popular Kickoff series. Now, you might be looking at this and thinking, it's a Football Manager game. However, it is not a Football Manager game. It is a Fantasy Manager game. You start the game by choosing how many players you're going to have crowded around the screen. A real challenge would be to assemble 15 like-minded people to sit around and play Fantasy Manager, the computer game. But if no human players are available, then you can have the computer take up those duties. Then you input your name, choose your kit, and you'll get to pick from the cream of the 1993 to 1994 Premier League season and compete in your own mini-league. Computer opponents won't tend to pick lots of different players. The computer will pick, say, Arsenal and just have that squad, so you'd have their famous 5 defenders at the back and Ian Wright up top. Then you will go into the purchasing phase where you're given £25 million to assemble your team. What funny figures they are nowadays. 25 million would probably get you Kurt Zuma's cat-kicking leg. The rank and file from the likes of Swindon, Ipswich, Sheffield Wednesday and Wimbledon can be bought for pennies, well, for less than £1 million. But the cream of the crop like Giggs and Shearer will set you back £5 million apiece. You can return to this screen after every game you play, and you can also sell your lame, underperforming players too. Wins will get you more money, so you can upgrade your Ian Dowies to your Sir Les Ferdinands or your Eric Cantonars, should you do well enough. While you can get by on 11 players, you can buy more than that and swap around your formation should something not be working with your team. The way that you can see if your players are performing or underperforming is by looking at the scores given by the computer at the end of each game. You'll want to keep your 8s and your 9 performers, but monitor those 5s and have your foot cocked and primed to vault the lacklustre chumps out of the door with your best kicking foot. And that's the game. Yes, like I said before, it is not a Football Manager game. There's no training, there's no dealing with loans, no endless reams of statistics, no sponsorships, and no coaching. It is fantasy football. You buy and sell players and keep them if they're doing well and ditch them if they're not. That is the game. And because it's fantasy football, you may end up having the same players as your opponent. For instance, I had 2 dollops of semen in each goal mouth during one tussle. Messy. Once you've picked your team, you'll be presented with the match display, which is a sequence of words that have things to do with football appearing randomly on the screen. They say things like yellow card, or corner, or throw-in, but they don't tell you which player, or even team, is receiving these messages. And yes, it is completely at random. 4 or 5 goal kicks in a row, why not? Your team may win. Not that you'll have any actual effect on the game, because obviously you can't change your team around in mid-game because it's fantasy football and you don't do that in fantasy football. It is not a football management game. How many times do I have to say this? But at the same time, and its biggest failing, is that the concept doesn't really work when there's not real players involved. When you're watching this on a weekly basis and your Saturday comes up and suddenly you're just as interested in Luton versus Bournemouth as you are in your team, or a top of the table tussle between 2 championship contending squads, there's none of that excitement with this concept. It's just missing the point of it, really. And worse than that, there's no real skill involved, bar a knowledge of, I suppose, who's good at football and who isn't. You see, there's no in-depth stats. You'll have no idea who scored the goals or who got the yellow cards. You could see that you've won by 3 goals and that your striker's only got 5 out of 10. Now, it could have been scored by the midfielder who got 8. However, you could get stuffed 3 or 4-0 and some of your defenders will get 8s or 9s. So it seems to me that the scores are completely random. So really, with this really very, very basic concept, it's not even doing that very, very basic concept well. It's a good thing then that it was released as a budget game. Oh no, it wasn't. It was released at £29.99. Good lord. The only thing that sort of kept me playing was that most magical of things. As a football fan, I'm sure you'll agree. Seeing the names of those 90s footballers, it makes you all kind of warm inside. Beyond that, it is yikes. This was backed up by the gaming press of the time. Steve McGill said this of Fantasy Manager the computer game in issue 69 of Amiga format. The message is clear. If you want to play fantasy football, there are cheaper, more enjoyable ways to do so. Check your favourite paper, it'll be worth it. 48% from them, and they were the nicest to it. Mr. Biffa reviewed it back on his Digitizer Teletext page, giving it a 15%, along with the simple epithet, poo, and it knows it is. And well, Paul Mellerick gave it an 8% in issue 55 of Amiga Power. He said, "This is truly awful. Don't waste my time. Ouch." So yeah, another stinker then. Will things get better? Hopefully. We'll have to ask Roy the Rovers though. Until then, like, subscribe, and thanks, bye.